Back again, and we're still on Matthew 24 verse 1, and the big question is, why would God write it this way, packing so much information into so few words? Now, if you think about your own daily life, you can understand why God would do this. People didn't have our modern technology. If they wanted to write something down, they had these huge tablets of wax and these like carving things that they used to make their temporary notes, and then they would have to apply a candle to it to erase. That's a lot to carry. So if you had a Bible, you wouldn't want it to be in wax, first of all, and secondly, you wouldn't want to have to carry it around. And actually, in those days, the Bible was written on huge sheets of what they called papyrus, which are like stalks of reeds, R-E-E-D-S, like in swamp. All right? They beat those reeds till they were paper thin, and then they processed them and washed them and bleached them so you could write. But each sheet was like 30 inches by 30 inches. That's not comfortable. So what people did is they just memorized scripture. That was the rule for them since Deuteronomy 30. Now, it wasn't just the Jews who did that. The entire ancient world had similar practices. You know, when people tell you, they look at some Bible verse and they say, well, the Bible isn't unique in what it says there. That's right. It's not. It's meant to communicate to an audience. So it uses concepts and words and ideas to communicate that those people will understand. So it takes something familiar. So here's what you got. Verse 1 is very compact, so it's easily memorized. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. We're not used to memorizing text, but they were, because it was such a hassle to carry it around. And basically, you had contests, and when people worked together, they would have whole chapters of the Bible memorized that they would chant to each other. Okay? And you can, if you look at the meter in the Greek, you can see that the Bible's actually written for that. Like when Peter writes 1 Peter and he's quoting Paul in Ephesians 1, it's like a song. So Paul has a verse, and then Peter slides his verse between him and Paul, and then the next verse is Paul's. So that's how people would, on their way to Ephesus or while walking, that's what they would do. That's how they would play with these words. The same was true for the Greek drama and Roman drama. Everybody memorized. You got big money for doing that. They called it rhetoric. It was a whole discipline. You were a good Greek or Roman citizen if you were good at rhetoric. Rhetoric meant that you memorized the literature of your people. Okay, well, for us, that's the Bible. Okay? For the Jews, that was the entire Old Testament. And you see Jesus quoting it a lot because everybody memorized it. All right? Just like we talk about Trump today. There's so much that happens in a Trump day that you have to memorize it to be able to fit it into context with the day before, 6 months ago, 2 years ago. And when anybody mentions just a few keywords like Jesus left, like Michael Cohen or Bill Barr or immigrants, that has a special meaning unique to the time because we're all living it together. The same was true then. So when you see such a compact verse, Jesus left, everybody memorized it. By the time this goes out in writing to the Jews in 30 AD, everybody had memorized it. Okay? It's real important to know this because when the later gospel writers write, they take what Matthew wrote and they change just a couple of words because they expect you to know by memory what was in Matthew. And they are updating Matthew with some new idea or use of the doctrine relative to the later time they write. So they just change a couple of words. Like if I said Jeff Sessions, you know a lot about what I'm talking about just by saying his name. If I said Bill Barr, you know the two of them had the same job. But I don't say that. I don't have to, because you have already memorized their names and their jobs. Okay? So that's why the text can be so short, which you need so you can memorize it. But then you use it, and your friends use it, and you're using it while you're cutting meat, and you're using it while you're stamping the papyri to make paper, and you memorize it and talk about it when you're going to sleep, because that was a law. God said, memorize this. When you get up, talk about it all day long. Talk about it all night long. Talk about it in your sleep. That's Deuteronomy 30. So how does that rule, that law, get done? By having short text. See? Now you can see where I'm pointing. Okay. By having short text, like Mathete. See? Then it's not working the way I want. All right? So that's why it's short. Now, I promised you I was going to cover in this section, how do we know that this whole verse that's covering 40 years covers the entire world of that time? Well, in order to really know the answer to that, you have to go look at the history between 30 and 70 AD. Basically, the history of that period was totally impacted by Jesus being here. It totally upended the Roman world. It totally upended the Jews. It started a civil war. That's the theme of Matthew 24 and 25, is civil war among believers. It started a civil war between Jew and Jew, between Gentile and Gentile, just as Christ promised it would. And that civil war went all over the world during these 40 years. Whether you like the Bible or believe in the Bible or believe its message or not, this is the actual history of what happened. Okay? The day he died, it was just some guy hanging on a cross in a dusty little country that was considered the armpit of the world. But after he died, all hell broke loose. In every way, in every country of the world. Starting with Rome itself, because the word of his resurrection 3 days later created a huge outcry, because people were sick to death of the pagan gods. They were sick of all those stupid rules. They did not believe in them anymore. They were jaded. They were bored. Okay? So it created a cultural upheaval, because now, for the first time, people have this hope about this guy who was alive during their time. And the story of his dying and being raised again, whether you believed it or not, was a powerful story. So word spread everywhere, especially within Rome. Okay? And so, you had your neighbor who was a centurion, or your neighbor who was a Jewish rabbi who believed it, or one who didn't. Okay? It was uproarious. So Jesus left is the character of those 40 years. It's because Jesus left that history was what it was between 30 and 70 AD. Because the temple represented him and he left. The word of what that meant spread all over Rome. Okay, but we're not talking about just Rome. Next to Rome was Parthia, and north of Rome were the barbarians, and south of Rome was Egypt. And Rome was the center. So everybody found out about this. Okay? Christ was a scandal when he died. He was a scandal when he was born. He was a scandal the whole time he was here. And so the word spread about it. So when Jesus left, that was the character of those 40 years, all around the world. As far away as China, they heard about it, and they were trying to compete with the popularity of Jesus leaving by reinventing Buddhism to include something that is called bodhisattva, which is a sort of savior concept that was not native to Buddhism before Jesus left. Okay? So Jesus left is the character of these 40 years. The temple was in uproar because the Jews now have a sort of civil war between them over whether they believe in the Jesus who left or not. And the temple was a battleground for that. So the Romans had to get involved with all these skirmishes between the Jews, and it got so bad by 66 AD, okay, that Nero said, okay, we just have to take down Jerusalem. We have to destroy it. Okay? So it was a scandal. So Jesus left was a character of those 40 years. The temple was character of the 40 years. And it was all about how you walked what was the spiritual life. It was all about his disciples who went all over the world during these 40 years to spread the message. And it was all about the buildings, especially about the buildings. See, in those days, a lot like now, people pride themselves on what they do. And you got this big, magnificent church that you build, this big, magnificent temple you build. I mean, that was Rome's own claim to fame. All their beautifully big buildings. Okay, fast forward to Hitler. Hitler made all these big buildings, and Adolf Speer, was it Adolf? Well, what was Speer's first name? S-P-E-E-R. Albert. I think he was Albert. He was the architect for all these buildings. Okay, but it's not just those two times. You look at India, especially India, and the Buddhist temples. I mean, the work that they did on those temples. If they had fed their people instead of building buildings, everybody would have been a lot happier. But they didn't, because it was an ego thing to build buildings. Oh, I'm a great person, Herod says to himself, because I rebuild the temple and everybody should love me. He built Caesarea for Caesar, Augustus Caesar, who was his best friend. Okay? Herod built a whole city for Augustus Caesar. Everybody at that time, between 30 and 70 AD, was into building. I'm a great person if I make a great building. I'm important if I live in a big, fancy building. We think the same way today. Look at New York City. That's one sick city. Its real estate prices are absolutely stupid. You pay $700,000 for a cracker box because, oh, it's New York City where all these great buildings are located. See, people don't care about real things. They care about looks. So 30 to 70 AD was about that. Now, what you have when you have all these looks, okay? Looks, the buildings. Everybody starts competing with each other over the buildings. And they compete enough, and then they start to try to kill each other over who gets to have the buildings. And so what happens is you have Caligula and his competition, which at the word temple here, okay, the first use of temple, that's not it. That one. Oh, that one. That's the word temple in Greek. And you say the word iyeru. At that word iyeru, that's when Caligula dies. It's 41 AD at that point. Caligula thought he was a god, and that when he would die, he would have his apotheosis. Okay? He actually dies at Yer, I-E-R, right here. Okay? The last two letters, instead of the O-U, he dies in the middle of the word, which means he didn't make it as a god. The Bible uses this snippy rhetoric all the time. Caligula dies in the middle of the word temple. Okay? So does Nero, who dies in 69 AD. See, here's the word iyeru again, right here. Can you see it? See the OU? OU is 70 AD. IER, Yer, it's actually IE. That's when Nero dies. He thought he was a god too. So you'll notice how God times the occurrence of the word iyeru to fit Caligula and Caesar's deaths, to make fun of them, to mock them. They thought that they were gods. Well, not quite, honey. You die in the middle of the word temple, not at the end of it. So you did not get deified. And of course, they didn't. So you see, the whole world is thinking like this. And they're competing, and therefore, what happens? Well, right here, Yeru, yeah, yuck, yeah. That's when Nero dies, and what happens? Civil War. The Civil War that started up here with the temple when Caligula dies, which is just after Christ died, because it took a while for the Civil War amongst the Jews to, harden. The Civil War that started when Caligula came to power and died is full-fledged over the entire Roman world. At the second IE, when Nero dies, Jews begin to see how clever God is. And this isn't just one instance. Every verse has something clever like this in it. That's why it's so slow. With the Bible, you have to go slow. That's why the verses are compact. So you can eat them over and over and taste the meaning in each different facet over and over. And speaking of over, my voice is over, so I better stop.